The night Boston stood still was the kind that gets under your skin. A raw, wet March night in 1990. The sort of damp cold that seeps through a heavy coat and settles deep in the bones. The city, for the most part, was asleep, or at least tucked away from the chill. But in the Fenway, two figures moved with a purpose that defied the hour and the weather. They drove a small, nondescript sedan, the kind of car that becomes invisible the moment it passes you. They pulled up to the side entrance of a palace, a Venetian fantasy of ornate stone and quiet grandeur rising from the Boston mud, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Their story begins not with a bang, but with a lie. A simple, effective lie. They rang the buzzer at the security desk. Inside were two young night watchmen, Rickabath and Randy Heston, working a monotonous job for a paycheck, their biggest concern likely the slow crawl of the clock towards morning. The voice that crackled over the intercom was calm, authoritative. "Police, we have a report of a disturbance in the courtyard." It was a believable lie. Kids, a prank, something. It was protocol to let the police in. When the door opened, the world of those two guards and the world of art itself fractured. These were not Boston's finest. They wore the uniforms, cheap, dark blue, with patches and badges that looked convincing in the dim light. But their faces were hidden by broad-rimmed trooper hats pulled low and thick, dark mustaches that looked like they'd been glued on in a hurry. They moved with a swift, brutal efficiency that was anything but police-like. "Don't move. Don't call anyone. This is a robbery." The command was a cold blade slicing through the quiet hum of the museum. They handcuffed the guards, first Randy, then they found Rickabath on his rounds. They used their own handcuffs, their own duct tape. There was a chilling intimacy to it. They sat the guards on the floor in the basement, away from the alarms, away from the phones. They bound their hands, their feet. They wrapped duct tape over their eyes, around their heads, a crude, suffocating blindfold. They told them they wouldn't be hurt if they cooperated. And then they were left. Two young men in the dark, listening to the footsteps of thieves echoing through the hallowed halls above them. That was the last sound they heard for 81 minutes. The footsteps of ghosts plundering a temple. The thieves knew things. They knew which motion sensors to avoid. They knew that if a sensor was triggered, the alarm would sound not at the police station, but only at the security desk of a private company, where a board operator would call the museum. And the thieves had already taken care of the phone. They knew the layout. They moved with the confidence of men who had a map etched on the backs of their eyelids. This was not a smash and grab. This was a surgical strike. Their first stop was the Dutch Room. This was the heart of the museum, Mrs. Jack's inner sanctum. The air in here was different, older, thick with the smell of old varnish and history. The thieves ignored the cabinets filled with Renaissance treasures, the delicate drawings, the ancient Roman busts. They were here for the big game. They went straight for Rembrandt, not one but two of his masterpieces. The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, Rembrandt's only known seascape, a monumental, turbulent canvas. You can feel the cold spray of the water, hear the panic of the disciples, see the divine calm on Christ's face as the boat is tossed in a frenzy of wind and wave. It is a painting of chaos and faith. The thieves didn't see that. They saw a rectangle of canvas and wood, a commodity. One of them took a knife, or perhaps a box cutter. The sound must have been a terrible, dry rip, a violation. They didn't carefully cut the canvas from its stretcher. They slashed it out, crude and hurried, like butchers. They did the same to the other Rembrandt, a lady and gentleman in black. Two somber, dignified figures, frozen in time for centuries, now unceremoniously sliced from their home. Then they turned their attention to the smallest, most delicate prize in the room, Johannes Vermeer's The Concert. In a museum filled with grand, dramatic works, this one was a whisper, a quiet, perfect moment. Three figures, a woman at a harpsichord, another singing, a man seated, listening. The light, that miraculous Vermeer light, falls softly on their faces, on the instruments, on the tiled floor. It is a painting about harmony, about the silent, invisible thread of music that connects us. It is one of only 34 Vermeers in the entire world, and they took it. They yanked it from the wall, likely handling it with the same crude disregard. Of all the losses, this one perhaps cuts the deepest. It was the silencing of a quiet song. But they weren't finished. They took objects too. An ancient Chinese bronze gu from the Shang dynasty, a beautiful ritualistic vessel called a ku. They took a small, self-portrait etching by Rembrandt and a landscape by his pupil, Govert Flinck. They stripped the room. They left the empty frames, grotesque skeletons on the wall, as if to mock the very idea of what was once there. They moved through the museum like a plague, a selective plague that targeted only the most priceless of things. In the short gallery, they took Degas' sketches, 5 of them. Quick, beautiful studies of dancers and jockeys ripped from their portfolios. They took the bronze eagle finial from the top of a Napoleonic flag. It was an odd choice, heavy, less obviously valuable, but they took it. And then the final, bizarre act. Upstairs in the Blue Room was Edouard Manet's Chez Tortoni, an elegant portrait of a man in a cafe, a single glass of beer on the table before him. It was a small, sophisticated painting. They took that too, and with that it was over. 81 minutes after they had entered, they were gone. The side door closed. The car, weighted down with $500 million of human genius, vanished into the wet, sleeping streets of Boston. The silence they left behind was heavier than any noise. It was the silence of absence. The morning light revealed the crime. The guards were found, shaken, humiliated, still bound in the basement. The police arrived. The FBI was called, and the horror dawned, room by room. The empty frames, the slashed canvases, the vacant spots on the wall where legends used to live. It was a crime scene that felt more like a sacrilege. Isabella Stewart Gardner, the formidable eccentric woman who had built this place as a gift to the city forever, had left one unbreakable rule in her will. Nothing could ever be moved. The collection was to remain exactly as she arranged it for all time. The thieves had not just stolen art, they had violated a sacred trust. They had broken a heart that had stopped beating decades before. The investigation began. It was, from the start, a maze with no exit. There were no fingerprints. The duct tape, the handcuffs were common, untraceable. The mustaches were fake, the uniforms were a costume. The car was never found. It was as if the 2 men had descended from a spaceship, done their work, and been beamed back up. But in the underworld, rumors are a currency of their own, and the whispers began to swirl around one name, Carmelo Merlino. A Boston hoodlum, a fixer, a man with grease on his hands and connections in every shadow. He ran an auto body shop in Dorchester. It was the kind of place where more than cars got fixed. It was a hub, a place where criminals met, where deals were made. The FBI would come to believe that Merlino was the local facilitator. He knew the players, he knew the fences, he could move stolen goods. But art, this was a different league. This wasn't hijacking a truckload of cigarettes. This was the big time. The trail, or the hope of one, led to the mob. Not the flashy Hollywood mob, but the gritty, pragmatic Irish and Italian gangs of Boston and Providence. The Winter Hill Gang. Years turned into decades. Whitey Bulger was caught, and he said nothing about the art. Names emerged from the murk. George Reisfelder, Leonard DiMuzio, both were violent criminals. Both were dead within a year of the heist, murdered in unrelated incidents. A convenient cleanup? Or just the violent, predictable end to violent, predictable lives? Then a break. A name that seemed to have real weight. David Turner. A known associate of Merlino's. A tough, savvy criminal believed to be part of a gang that pulled off armored car robberies. The FBI was convinced he was one of the 2 men in the museum that night. They had a witness, a criminal turned informant, who said Turner had confessed to him. But the evidence was circumstantial. It was the word of a criminal against another. Turner was eventually convicted on other charges, armored car robbery, and sent to prison for decades. From his cell, he has always maintained his innocence regarding the Gardner. He even offered to take a polygraph, an offer the FBI, suspicious of their reliability, never took him up on. And then there was the most tantalizing, most frustrating lead of all. It came from a different direction, from the world of fine art itself. In 1994, 4 years after the heist, the museum's director of security, a former FBI agent named Lyle Grindle, and the museum's lawyer, Arnold Hyatt, received a series of mysterious messages. A man calling himself X contacted them. He claimed to represent people who had the art. He was sophisticated. He knew the nuances of the pieces. He wasn't a thug. He sounded like an insider. He set up a meeting in a hotel room in New York. The museum sent a representative. The instructions were precise, like something from a spy novel. The representative was to wait for a call. The call came. The voice on the other end, X, was calm, educated. He said the paintings were safe. He said his clients wanted two things: immunity from prosecution and the reward money, which at that time was $1 million. But then he added a strange, specific condition. The reward money had to be paid, not to him, but to a third party, a man named Paul Hendry. And Hendry, the FBI would discover, was a known associate of Carmelo Merlino. The Boston underworld was connected to this sophisticated X. The negotiations dragged on. X was clever. He provided proof of life. He sent a Polaroid of the Rembrandt seascape, along with the original Boston Herald front page from the day after the robbery. It was the first real proof that the paintings had survived the heist. It was a jolt of electricity for the investigators. But X was paranoid too. He demanded the FBI formally announce the immunity deal on the front page of the Boston Globe. The FBI, wary of setting a precedent, hesitated. The dance continued. X sent a second Polaroid, this one of the stolen Rembrandt etching. He was playing them, showing he held all the cards. The final act of this particular drama was set in a conference room at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Philadelphia. The FBI had set up a sting. They were ready to make the deal. They had the immunity paperwork. They had the money. They waited for X to call and give the final instructions for the exchange. The phone never rang. Had vanished. He simply disappeared back into the shadows from which he came. To this day, no one knows who he was, or if he was a genuine intermediary or an elaborate hoax. The Polaroids were the last confirmed sighting of the Gardner art. They have not been seen since. The years bled into one another. The empty frames in the Gardner Museum remained empty, a monument to a wound that would not heal. The investigation grew cold, then would be jolted awake by a new tip, a new theory, always leading to a dead end. In the early 2000s, the focus shifted back to Carmelo Merlino. The FBI, using an informant, wired him up and got him talking. Merlino, now an old man, was still a braggart. This is not just a story about a theft. It is a story about ghosts. The ghosts of the two thieves, their identities still shrouded in mystery. The ghosts of the night watchman, forever defined by those 81 minutes of terror. The ghost of Isabella Stewart Gardner, her eternal wish violated. And the ghosts of the art itself. The paintings have never been offered for sale. Not a single brushstroke has surfaced in 30 years. But the frames remain empty. The museum keeps them there, as per Isabella's will. They are a promise, a vow that until the art comes home, the museum itself is incomplete. The investigation remains open. The reward stands. $10 million for information leading to the recovery of the art. The phone lines are still active. The FBI still has a dedicated team. They are waiting for the call. They have been waiting for over 3 decades. The truth is waiting too. The ghosts are not at rest, and until they are, the story is not over.